Hey, welcome back to Excel VBA for professionals. I want to go into the code. Before I do that, I just want to teach you one fundamental concept that you need to understand before you dive into code directly. And that is a concept of how a programmer thinks. And once you instill these methods into how to create your macro or your VBA script, then I guarantee you that things are going to get a lot easier, because initially when beginner programmers start out, they don't know how to put the pieces together, and that's what I'm here for. I'm here to help you do that. So let's take a look. And it's going to be a long presentation. I'm just going to cover this and then we'll go into the code. So there's three concepts in programming that I concentrate on in all courses. There's input, process, and output, and that's at a very high level, and that's all you have to really understand when you're writing a macro or any type of program. Is you have to know where your input is coming from, you have to know how to process that input, and then you have to decide what you're going to do with the actual result, which is your output. And what we're going to do through this course is we're going to first concentrate on input. And then once we understand what input is and how we manipulate the input, then we can go along with the process part. And the output is very easy. Now in macros and VBA, your input most of the time is not going to come from the user, but it's going to come from an Excel sheet, which you want to process. So let's get started in terms of how do we start? Where do we go in terms of input? Am I going to start with the Excel sheet? How do I manipulate? No, we're not. What we're going to start with is simple data types. In the programming world, everything is represented by a data type. So let's prop this open here. I'm going to go to Visual Basic, and then I'm just going to create a macro, a simple macro. So I'm just going to call this my first. Create. And this is my first macro that I can do. Now if I run this with the play button, it's going to do some actions, but let me first code something real quick. You can follow along and then you can see your results. In VBA there are a lot of data types. We're only going to concentrate on the ones that I think are important, that you're going to use for your everyday needs, and we'll cover them one by one. When we talk about input, we have to represent data. And the way that you represent data is by defining storage. So let me give you an example. For example, in VBA, you have syntax of the language, obviously. Just like the English language, you have syntax for how you speak, for how you write sentences. Same thing in VBA. And for me to start with the input part, I have to define what my storage is going to be. And I have to represent the data in a modular format so that it is segregated from everything else. For example, if I want to represent a number that I'm going to be constantly using, I would probably declare using we always declare a storage using dim, and we say dim my number, and then in VBA you have to give it a data type, and that's what I was talking about in terms of input. Every input is going to have a data type, and if I want to represent an integer, I would say as integer. Now VBA has IntelliSense, which means that it will automatically detect what data types are available to you. So if we go back and I scroll up and down, look at all the data types that I have available to me. Some are data types, some are object types, but we won't really concentrate on that right now. So now I have an integer which I am holding for storage, and I can now set that integer to any value I want. So if I say my number is equal to 10, the value of that, what we call a variable, is now the value 10. And remember I went over output. In VBA, your output would eventually be your resulting spreadsheet, but for beginner's sake, we're always going to use the MsgBox for output. So for example, if I say MsgBox value of my number, and then the ampersand means I'm concatenating this string with, it's gonna do that, it's fine, to my variable. So what's happening here? So what I'm doing is I'm defining a variable called my number. Its data type is integer, so I can hold any integer that I want. There is a limitation to how much you can hold, and I can give you a link on my YouTube page and what each data type holds, but for now it's not important. We set the value of my number to 10, and then we want to print it out to the user somehow as output. We're not doing any processing here, we're just declaring our input and we're sending it out to output. So now if I run this, see that value of my number 10, because I defined it as 10. Now we have many data types, so I can also define a floating point number, so float as double. So what that means is now in the float num, in my float num variable, I can store floating point numbers such as 20.05. Integers are whole numbers, so I cannot store any floating point values, even if I tried. So you have to be specific as to what data type you're actually representing. So those of you that are finance and doing some type of currencies and all that, you always really want to stick to double, and perhaps integer would be a number that you know that's not going to have any type of floating point properties to it. And then you also have a string, so I can represent a string as my string as string, and I can say that my string is equal to test. So we represent a string with double quotes, and I can do the same thing here where, if I want to print out my string, I can just say my string without anything else concatenated to it. So what MsgBox is going to do is it's going to take whatever's in my string and just print it out. So let's take a look at that. See that? Test. Right? And I can do the same thing with my other variables. So if I say float num, and then I can do that 20.05, and my number would be 10, right? So I can do a lot of stuff with printing stuff out, and I can concatenate my strings with the ampersand as you've seen. Now you can also have a Boolean value, which can be represented with the data type Boolean. So we can say Boolean value as Boolean. Now this is different because you can only really represent two values with this. You can either do a true or false. So if I do this, you see you have true or false. So I can say false, and then Boolean value, print that out and see what my value is. So if I run this, it's false. Whatever I set it, if I say true, right? Sorry, I guess it's got to be uppercase. Then I can print that out and have it be true. And last but not least, there's a lot more, but these are the most important ones. And as we go through the lecture, I'll show you other data types that we may be able to use. But these are the fundamental ones that you can start practicing on. There is a variant data type, which means that it really is not represented in terms of any number or string. We can just call this var value. So variant means that I can store anything I want here. I can store a number, I can store a string, I can store a Boolean. It really doesn't matter. Now what's the difference? Well, the difference is, if we're looking at a little bit more deeper in terms of programming and computers, every data type is going to take up space in memory. And for every data type, there is a reserved amount of bytes. And you can think of it in terms of closet space. So in your house, you have big closets, you have small closets, you have medium-sized closets, you have walk-in closets. So my number, float number, my string, Boolean value have a reserved amount of closet space that's pretty much limited to a smaller to medium size, which is good. Which is good because that means that you're not going to write a macro that's going to destroy your storage for your program, because then how efficient would that be? If you look at variant, there is a size for in terms of memory. So I'll give you an example. My number, probably a medium, small closet space. That means this size is going to be 2 bytes. If we look at double, this is going to be 8 bytes. So the larger the number of bytes, the bigger your closet space is. The problem with variant is that this is going to be 16 bytes. And if you declare everything as a variant, it's not efficient, because that means everything that you're storing is going to take up 16 bytes, which will make your macro larger. So we want to make sure that when you are declaring your input and your data types, it is the size or the specific data that you are looking for. So that's why it's good to know about input and data types. So that's it for today. That's it for this video. Join me on the next video and we'll add on to this input concept. Thanks.